See you on here. And Fanta, nice to see you on here as well. For those just joining, if you want to turn on your video and also chat something that you can see right now that's making me smile. I'm seeing happiness is my kids all coming home next week from school. Beautiful. And sunny skies in Maine from Jessie. Love it. Welcome, everyone. If Vinny is on the line, if you want to try, I don't see her yet. Welcome, Isabel and Katrin. Welcome, Vinny. Good to see you. Join. Seeing that some things making folks smile is lunchtime on the East Coast. Absolutely. A painter that my sister made. Got a couple folks on the line. Vinny, do you want to try out your sound just to make sure we can hear you loud and clear?
How's this sounding?
Sounds great.
Great.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Megan, Maria. Great to see you on here. If folks want to turn on their video so we can see y'all's beautiful faces and chat something in the chat box that you can see right now that's making you smile. Great to see y'all's faces. Welcome, Nikhil. Okay, we'll wait one more minute and see if Thea joins, and then we'll get things rolling. Cat sunbathing in the windowsill. Okay, there's a theme of pets in sunshine. Love it. Okay, we will get things started. Welcome everyone. My name is Lindley Meese, and I'm really excited to host this second in a 5-part series, online series called The Underpinning Stories. And what we're doing here together is over the course of these 5 conversations, we're really grappling with some of the assumptions and frames that underlie decisions inside and outside of philanthropy that really shape who and what climate solutions are funded. My colleague Jessie is going to chat a blog post that we wrote that describes the 5 frames that we're exploring over the arc of this series. So you can read that to learn a little bit more about the thinking and questions behind each one. And of course, this one, we're exploring the really juicy frame of scale. And, you know, this is within a context and a moment where there's just incredible political polarization, and there's increasing recognition in philanthropy that we're clearly not doing enough. And perhaps sometimes we're supporting the wrong things. And we want to create a space for emergent and really honest conversation where we can push each other as a community of practice to identify what are the underlying assumptions and frames that we use that really get at who and what gets funded. We're seeing more and more opinions about what's right, the right way to fund, and there's less and less listening. So we're trying to really listen across foundations, across funders, across those that are funded. And of course, we're talking about climate, which is one of the kind of stickiest and most challenging crises of our time, which is not easy, and it's so critical, particularly when climate funding is 0.8% of overall philanthropic funding, so a tiny amount. We're honored to have a really amazing set of speakers with us to dig into how they think about scale and how that frames the field of climate philanthropy. I'll have them all wave when I take things off screen share, and you can see everyone together. I'll introduce them after we introduce ourselves to each other. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. In an effort to make this feel more like a conversation and less like a bunch of talking heads literally on a screen, we invite everyone to turn on your video if possible, just so we can see each other as we have this conversation. Second, I want to make a strong plug for an active chat box. You can show your love after someone has said something, ask a question, share a musing that you have, really using that space to make it feel like an active dialogue. And we have 2 amazing chat box monitors, Jessie and Veronica, who are going to be feeding some of what is shared in that chat box into the conversation throughout. Third, You can, okay, this is just a little briefer on what you can see at the bottom of your screen to start your video, and turn on your chat box if you click the chat button. This is showing that you can toggle your view, so you can see everyone Brady Bunch style, or you can see just the speaker, which might be a little less distracting. And finally, we have tech support. So if you have any trouble over the next 90 minutes with this platform, you can chat at Carol-Tech Support, and she'll do what she can to help you out. And then finally, a note on confidentiality. We're recording this call, as you can see, and it will be shared with the co-sponsors of this list. And if there's any media, this conversation is off the record. So we ask that you reach out to any of the participants directly if you want to learn more about their perspective or receive a quote or anything like that. We recognize this is a public event, so anyone can be on here. Finally, let's just take a moment to center ourselves, grab what you need to be comfortable the next hour and a half, a notepad, anything you need to stay present. Actually close down your email, see what it's like to treat this like an in-person conversation. And then we'll take a couple breaths. Okay. So to give us a feel of who is in the room, we're going to do a quick poll, followed by a meet and greet. My co-host Sam is going to throw up a poll right now to kick us off. And the question is, what hat are you wearing in this conversation? Recognizing that many of us wear many different hats, and we might not fully identify with any of these buckets, but just mark whichever one you're wearing most for this discussion. And I'm sorry for folks on the phone, you won't be able to use this feature. All right, so it looks like we're a little over half institutional philanthropy, about half institutional philanthropy, about a third nonprofits, and then some other folks. All right, one interested public, welcome, that's awesome. Cool. Okay, let's close that down. The second one is a temperature check of how folks are orienting around our topic. So the question is, what do you think about the frame of scale in the context of the climate crisis? So even if these categories, I don't know if Sam, you're able to launch that poll. I can. Okay, give me 1 second. Give Sam one more moment to throw up that second poll, if possible. Okay, maybe we won't do the second poll. All right, so moving ahead, great to get a general sense of who's in the room in terms of funders, nonprofits, interested public. Now we're gonna break you into really brief breakout groups to meet some of the other folks on the call. On our last dialogue, this was one of folks' favorite part, was actually working with and talking with other folks. So in a moment, a small box will appear at the middle of your screen, and you just press accept. And if you don't see the box, try checking behind the Zoom window. Sometimes that happens. And phone folks will be automatically put into groups. You'll have 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes to introduce yourselves to each other using the prompts that Jesse is going to share in the chat box. So you can start out by saying your name, your any affiliation you want to share, your gender pronouns, and then answering the question, what brings you to the conversation today? And so you'll have about 1 minute each to share and get a sense of who else is on the call. Okay, let's do it. Well, welcome back, folks that are joining. Greg, you are in the main call now.
Yeah, I know I am. I'm just wondering if everyone else is.
I think folks are now slowly rejoining. Welcome, folks that are just rejoining. As folks return to the main room, if you want to use the chat box to share one highlight in terms of why you're here, why one of the folks in your breakout rooms, something that inspired you from what they said. Thank you, Greg, for sharing. Welcome. Excited to have you.
Deborah's over there.
Oh.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Folks still joining. So as folks come in from the breakouts, if you want to use the chat box to share why you're here, something that came up in your conversation. Thanks, Nikhil. Your comment. Thanks, Danielle. Working on climate force displacement initiative and wanting to learn and contribute to the conversation. Awesome, thanks, Hillary. From Jenna, we're doing more in the climate mitigation, watershed restoration space. I'm excited to join the call. If anyone else wants to share what they're thinking in the chat box, we'll give it 30 more seconds. Awesome, new to philanthropy and here to learn. Thanks, Fanta. All right, I hear a lot of excitement and interest from both folks that have been in this space and are interested in really building out nuances around scale, and then also a number of folks that are newer to philanthropy and curious both about what is the climate funder conversation, as well as what is the conversation in philanthropic spaces overall. Cool. Okay, so as folks continue to add, let's transition to kicking off the dialogue. So I want to start by introducing the host, the CLIMA Fund. CLIMA is a collaboration among 4 international grant-making organizations reaching grassroots work around the world: Global Green Grants, Grassroots International, Thousand Currents, and Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights. And CLIMA raises and then regrants funding for women, indigenous, peasant, and youth-led work, really confronting the root causes of climate change and building, supporting communities in building resilience from the ground up. We're a fund for larger funders to be able to make big investments in grassroots climate solutions, and we're working collectively to provide a continuum of support across our different strategies for grassroots movement building. CLIMA is really excited to have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. I will introduce them. Let me share my screen over here so they can wave at you if you're in the Brady Bunch style. So first we have Ellen Dorsey, who's the Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund, if Ellen wants to wave. Wallace Global is a private foundation focused on progressive social change in the fields of environment, democracy, human rights, and corporate accountability. And she also launched the Divest Invest Philanthropy campaign, which is a coalition of over 170 foundations committed to deploying their investments to address the climate crisis, which we'll probably hear about more later today. Next, we have Vinny Banzali, if you can wave, is the Executive Director of the Solidaire Network, the new director of the Solidaire Network, which is a membership-based community of people with wealth who are committed to supporting progressive social movements. She's also the recent former executive director of Thousand Currents and also now a board member. And I happen to know that she's an amazing karaoke singer. Thea Gelsman is the membership and solidarity director at the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And there, Thea coordinates a lot of the collective work between hundreds of diverse organizations, movements, and independent experts that are part of the network, and manages the rapid response for human rights defenders work at the network. And finally, we have Kevin Starr, if Kevin can wave. Kevin is the executive director of the Mulago Foundation, where he has been for over 20 years. And there he focuses on supporting scalable solutions to meet the basic needs of the very poor. And we'll be hearing more about their model soon. So welcome to all of our speakers. And as we dive in, I just want to make one more plug for an active chat box. We'll have chat box monitors that are integrating comments and questions from folks into the conversation. So please feel free to share reflections and questions that are coming up as the conversation progresses. Okay, so I would love to give each speaker few minutes to talk about kind of how they think about scale in their work before we get into some of the nitty gritty. And Ellen, I would love to start with you if you want to share how Wallace Global thinks about scale in your work and how and why that's a useful frame.
Well, I think that scale really means power. And it means building power and capacity commensurate with the scale of the problem. So I think the challenge for all of us in philanthropy is to think about how to build power and capacity of movements, because we believe at Wallace Global Fund that movements are where power is located and should be located, and to build the capacity of movements to really challenge the systemic drivers of problems, and in this case, the climate crisis. And of course, there's no problem greater in terms of the scale and the pace. And so with climate, I think another variable in thinking about scale is not just the magnitude of the problem, not just the power of the drivers of the problem, we'll come back to that, but it's also the pace of the problem. We work on a lot of different issues. Climate kind of cuts across all of our work, but as urgent as every issue we work on, we don't have a deadline imposed by the science like we have with climate change. And so the scale and the pace are both crucial. We were asked to reflect on what scale means. And I think what's important is, for us, scale is not about the scale that individual NGOs have. That scale has to be about the power of movements. And while we're a funder and our currency is writing checks, it's one of our tools, but that's what most of philanthropy thinks about themselves as writing checks to NGOs. We think we have to expand that notion and think about what is our role and our power and our relationship vis-a-vis movements. How do we use all of our tools to build those movements, build the capacity, the power of movements, and then to support movements as they evolve? So for us, when we're asked these questions about how do you measure scale, how do you measure your impact, we're focused on the movement. Movements aren't easy to measure by definition. They're hydra-headed. They're distributed. Power is distributed. And so you're thinking about the role that you can play in supporting those movements directly, supporting NGOs who can get in behind a movement and support its work appropriately. And then the other tools you can bring to that movement fight, i.e. your investments. Are you invested in the companies and the financial system that's driving the problem that you're saying you're supporting a movement to fight against? Are you using your social legitimacy as a foundation to help that movement? Are you heeding the demands of the movements yourself as an institution? I think these are all the metrics you have to look at when you're trying to relate to a movement and to help build the power of a movement. And the only other thing that I'll say, and this is maybe a little bit different of a direction, but scale is also related to the effectiveness of strategies and whether strategies and tactics help build efficacy and therefore build movement power. And so we've been very involved from the very beginning I would say even embedded in the movement calling for divestment from fossil fuels and investment in climate solutions and communities and just transitions, et cetera. And one of the exciting things about being embedded in a movement like that is you're watching the replicability of the movement's tactics that get picked up and can be replicated in different ways. And then you're also watching the movement evolve, change, dramatically grow, keep on evolving. And as a funder, I think you have to be constantly relating to that iteratively and trying to scale opportunities with the movement. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ellen. You just laid out a lot of really important points that I'm hoping to dig into more. I love how you started in terms of scale is about building power commensurate with the problem, and is not necessarily correlated to the size of the nonprofit. And then you outlined a lot of really important principles about how to be in solidarity with movements and some of the complexities of relating kind of traditional views of scale with movement building, given the lack of metrics and measurability. So excited to dig into that more. Let's turn to Thea. If you can share a little bit about how you think about scale in your work, and some of the kind of pitfalls and opportunities of using that frame in your work.
Greetings, everyone. It's great to be able to join you all today. I should start by just clarifying that ESCRnet is not a funder, actually. We work with a lot of grantees of the human rights and climate justice movement around the world. And so we've been invited into this conversation to join the strategic part of it, but I'm not able to speak as much to questions directly of priorities from a funder perspective. ESCRnet is the largest international network dedicating to advancing economic, social, and cultural, as well as environmental rights, interdependent from the wider human rights spectrum. Currently, we have over 280 members, the majority being organizational members in almost 80 countries around the world. And so I'm joining you today from our Secretariat office in New York, where we coordinate collective work amongst members that's really oriented toward facilitating mutual learning and knowledge sharing, building of solidarity, really fostering and nurturing constructive collaborations and alliances between different civil society groups, and really in its ultimate expression, helping groups from different parts of the world, deepen a shared analysis in terms of what they're up against as well as what they're fighting for, and then to join forces across borders and across contexts in truly collective efforts to push for, systemic change, really. So ESCRNet's about 15 years old, and by virtue of being a big global network with large NGOs among our membership, as well as very small community-based organizations, social movements, and some independent experts, scale means something really unique just by virtue of being a network in that way. I would say, just building on some of the last remarks that Ellen had made, this whole idea of trying to identify where strategies might be replicable, where groups might learn from each other's approaches, both in terms of what has worked well, as well as some of the shortfalls of different approaches there, has been something that we've really tried to, cultivate and hold space for over time. There's several other ways I think that we could talk about scale in the context of this work as a network. One of them is that we do have a bunch of members that are involved in spaces that we would refer to as like standard setting, or places where standards are evolved and further clarified, as well as in spaces where they're looking critically at the question of implementation of existing standards. And that relates, like I said, to human rights, as well as environmental issues more broadly. And in those engagements, oftentimes, members are coming to those spaces from a perspective of really trying to foreground the lived experiences of people and communities whose lives are directly affected by different injustices, and have some real clarity in terms of what might entail solutions there. So very concretely, that means that we tried to facilitate spaces that foreground leaders from social movements and grassroots organizations and communities that are really able to represent those perspectives. And then we work with other allies and members and groups in the field to really try to make sure that those perspectives are heard in different, like I said, policy and standard setting spaces. Some of the members do that through strategic litigation, or like I mentioned before, work to try to implement what seem to be positive legal decisions at regional or global levels or in domestic courts, and to really look at how that might make a difference on the ground in the lives of people who are affected by the issues that brought them to court to begin with. Largely, the approach to this network is an approach that I would describe as movement building. It's an approach that's really tried to foster, like I said before, learning and like analysis building. These are groups that are coming from really different contexts. And so a lot of what we do in terms of our facilitation approach is to really help leaders identify what they have in common with folks from really different parts of the world, or groups that are affected by displacement causing projects, by irresponsible corporate activity, by patriarchal and gender stereotypes and norms, and variety of different issues that I think we would all recognize as expressions of social injustice. And again, foregrounding the analysis of those people on very local and immediate levels for whom these issues really are real and incredibly personal. Over time, I'd say particularly over the last 5 years, more and more members in the network are talking about systemic change, and they're really trying to look at some of the drivers at a global level of the different injustices that might be prompting groups to mobilize. They may have really different expressions and faces on the ground, right? So there's been a lot of discussion amongst our membership, for example, around the issue of corporate capture of the state, of democratic processes and institutions and decision-making as a phenomenon that groups around the world are seeing. They're trying to name, they're trying to generate narratives around that in a way that'll help really call that out and expose it, as well as to enable, human rights to be a tool to resist and to counter those kind of power dynamics that we're seeing. There's a lot more discussion, I think, now when groups are embattled in different social justice struggles on the question of, who is gaining and profiting from these injustices? What is that wider systemic arrangement behind that? And what do we need to know, and how we need to position ourselves to really be able to make a difference and to change those fundamental power inequities? So, there's a number of our members do work on climate change as an issue in its own right. I think even a bigger swath of members incorporate an analysis of climate justice into the work that they do in a variety of spheres, and it's becoming more and more, in my observation, mainstreamed within the discussions about economic, social, cultural, environmental rights and human rights, particularly when you're really talking about that in the context of people's ability to live in dignity and to control their own futures. So I really look forward to the conversation today and unpacking some of the assumptions and models that we're all working within, as well as responding to, and also to hear more about the opportunities that some of you have all identified moving forward.
Thanks, Thea. I appreciate you bringing up, again, Ellen mentioned this as well, kind of the challenge or the connection between scale and systems change and the value of moving to root causes in order to get the scaled impact that we're all after. So I'm curious to dig a little bit more into that after in a little bit. So Kevin, I'd love to turn to you. I know that you actually have a slide that you want to share that just explains how Mulago thinks about scale.
Hey everybody. So what Mulago does is we find and fund organizations that we think have a scalable solution to conservation or the basic needs of the very poor, and who we think can deliver it on the way to scale. And so basically we started looking at conservation. We want to bring conservation and development together. And we looked at conservation through the same lens we had development for a long time. And we live in this sort of social entrepreneurship world where you have a solution and you're interested in really taking that solution all the way to scale. And that seems to be the frame. And we've also been a big part of measuring impact in the development world. So we're interested in bringing those things to conservation. So I'll just show you what we mean by scale and what we think about how to get there. So here I'm going to just share a slide, and it's I'm gonna go backwards in it. So what we're really talking about here is getting to a curve, and if we graph impact over time, what we're interested in seeing is that people get a model through an R&D stage where they really have something replicable, that they replicate it to understand how scalable it is and how to take it to scale, and then finally they do take it to scale. And getting to that question of what scale is for us, it's the vision that's at the top of that scale curve, which is to say the mission at really solving the problem level. So the mission could be saving reefs in the South Pacific. It could be saving elephants throughout Africa. It could be providing primary health care to everybody in West Africa, whatever the potential of that solution might be. And the questions then that we have that really clarify things is, if you have a solution that you do at the outset, well, who's the doer at scale? As somebody mentioned, it's rarely just you. And it might be lots of NGOs replicating your model. It might be a lot of businesses replicating your business model that creates impact, or maybe government takes on what you do. And then we're interested in the payer at scale. And so that's only four things. A for-profit solution, it's customers, it might be taxes, it might be big aid in a lot of countries where Malaga works, governments don't actually raise much taxes, or it's private philanthropy. And once we understand that, we can understand, okay, what's really going to make that curve bounce upward? It isn't just by accident or magic. And we've come to think of that as the big shift, and that there are 5 things that we can think about systematically that might drive it. One is the doer really takes up the burden of doing the work. The payer at scale takes on the burden of paying for the work at scale. Perhaps there's some way in which tech can amplify or accelerate the model. Maybe the model can actually streamline and get more efficient. And then policy change may open up opportunities or lower barriers. And how we think about going from that initial R&D stage to replication is, R&D is about getting a replicable model and developing something that's systematic and doable. And also, we think very systematically about what scalable means in the context of our doer and payer, that it's big enough, there's a big enough arena for it to operate in that it could actually go to scale, that it's simple enough that your doer could actually do it, and that it's cheap enough for that your payer would actually be willing to pay for it. And then to really move out of R&D, we want to see some persuasive case for impact. Maybe not a randomized controlled trial level of impact, but something that persuades us that, yeah, there's something we could really, has the potential for impact at scale. And then going from replication to real scale, we want to see that the replicability of the model has been that much more worked out, that it's honed, it's actually been replicated. We understand the unit cost and where efficiencies are to be found, and we understand the systems necessary to monitor performance, the kind of information systems needed, and finally, do we understand its scalability that much more? Are we ready? Are we getting ready for the big shift? And is there a rigorous case for impact? Because we don't think anything should really scale up unless you've done the work to really understand there's impact worth scaling. And that's the way that we think about scale and impact and how to get there. And this is, for us, the basic canvas that creates an understanding of how to come up with strategy.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. That was really helpful, and I think introduces a lot of kind of pieces of the puzzle that we want to dig into more, particularly around measurement and who are the actors, and also what are the underlying assumptions of what scale is. Is it replicability? Is what kind of impact, et cetera. So I'm excited to dig into that a little bit more, but I want to give Vinny one more, our last speaker, an opportunity to share a little bit about how you think about scale at Solidaire, as well as, of course, your work over a decade at Thousand Currents. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Lindley? Yeah. Okay, great. So, yeah, I think there's a common thread between both Thousand Currents and Solidaire, and I think our view is that scale, not just for scale's sake, but for transformative social change, and transformation as defined and led by grassroots organizers, grassroots groups, social movements, and their leadership. And so when I think of movement at scale, I often think about the Via Campesina with its 200 million farmers. You know, it's an international movement that has been bringing together peasants, small-scale farmers, landless peoples, indigenous peoples for years. And after a 17-year advocacy battle recently, there was an important win that I know the CLIMA Fund's members have been a big part of helping support, a win to actually have passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. It's significant, and we can learn so many lessons from a movement like the Via Campesina about what it means to lead global advocacy efforts that are deeply grounded in the lived experiences of farmers, rural peoples, and indigenous peoples. So that's sort of, and that's just one movement of many. I often think to myself, what would be possible if we in philanthropy actually thought of scale differently? So Solidaire is a community of people with wealth who make long sustained contributions to social movements, but are also really interested in building relationships, learning from and learning with and accompanying movements in the long haul. And I think part of the question that presents ourselves as within philanthropy, whether we're an individual donor network or public foundations networking together or private funders, is what is the scale of our own imagination? What is the scale of our influence and agency to solve the climate crisis? Are we going to simply continue to do the easy thing, which is to move billions towards false solutions that are easy, widgety, technocratic ways to look at the issue? Or are we going to actually engage in an imaginative and creative way with the scale of climate justice solutions worldwide, including in the United States, that are requiring resources to actually be able to transform the way we look at not only the climate crisis, but also our economy. And so that's something that motivates us, motivates me, and I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Awesome, thank you, Vinny. I have a couple questions, and I know there's some really good questions in the chat. First, does any of the speakers want to respond to what each other said around how they think about scale and some of the assumptions that they're making?
I don't know how to think about scale without accountability for impact. So when I hear words like movement, et cetera, I don't know as a funder what to think. I might be throwing my opinions out there, but they're just opinions. And for us, we have to really understand who's supposed to do what differently and how that links to concrete impacts over time. So there's a lot there that I feel like I don't know enough to really assess. And that's why we need to be measuring impact for ourselves, for Malago. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but for ourselves, we have to be measuring impact to create a shared reality around what's happening, so we kind of get past opinions.
Great. So what I heard there was, for Mulago, a need to really attach clear and specific metrics so that you as the funder understand what is being achieved and how that maps onto a model of scale. Because again, for your model, scale is at the core of what you're after. Does any of the other speakers want to respond to that?
On to that, because I'm not sure I understand why focusing on movements and movement building is about opinions. So I'll just give a very concrete example. Movements take different forms, just like NGOs take different forms, and sometimes philanthropy can play a role in supporting an existing movement or help seed and grow a movement. So in our case, we're in the middle of a global social movement, the fossil fuel divestment movement. And we have supported this movement because after decades of philanthropy pouring billions and billions and billions of dollars into policy fights that failed, because the fossil fuel industry had captured government all around the world. We are proud to support ESCR's NET's corporate capture work, so I'm going to give a shout out to that. That the fossil fuel divestment movement turned its focus away from policy and to the right target, the driver of the problem, the fossil fuel industry itself, and use the lever of finance to help weaken the power of the industry. So when we started supporting that movement, we sat down with our board and I said, the measure of our success is not going to be the number of institutions that divest initially. It's going to be building youth leadership focused on the right problem, not being bussed down to DC, but, you know, proverbially burning down their campuses and targeting the money, which is the money is what talks with the industry, and that we would consider success over time, the growth of the movement, the distributed leadership of the movement, and whether the NGOs working in environment, climate, and human rights began to support that movement. So we started supporting this movement 9 years ago. We have spent $9 million in direct grants to organizations supporting the movement over those 9 years. We have spent, we've made 150 grants, $9 million. And now we have reached a threshold that organizations that have publicly committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment globally have assets exceeding $6 trillion. So that's a return on investment for our foundation of $9 million spent over 9 years with 8 trillion, did I say 6? I meant to say 8. 8 trillion moved, 1,000 institutions divested. But more importantly, hydra-headed movement, distributed leadership, and those young activists that were behind the divestment movement are the ones leading Sunrise and calling for a Green New Deal in the US and building real power. So I don't think supporting movements is a matter of opinion, but what we do in philanthropy all the time is make judgments about what leadership to back, what strategies to back, what tactics to back. We bring to it ideology and assumptions. No matter how we approach it, we bring ideology and assumptions to it. So I think supporting movements is more complicated. It forces us to widen our lens so that we're not just thinking transactionally, one-on-one in a relationship with NGOs and additively of adding up those grants. But I can go to my board and say, these were our goals when we came in, here's how we measure impact, here's how this movement's built over time, here's been our role in this movement, and here's what this movement is accomplishing.
Thank you, Ellen. That was super helpful, and I heard both that there was a suspension of judgment. There was very strategic analysis of what is the driver and the end state that you're going for, but not necessarily a set of very specific measurements, which was what Kevin was asking about at the beginning, and then had this incredibly, like, exponentially enormous outcome at the end. One assumption that I feel like we haven't quite addressed that Kevin brought up is why movement building. So I don't know if one of the speakers wants to talk about why movement building when we're talking about scale.
Sure, I might actually just build a little bit on the most recent comments. I really appreciate the question. I think it's important that we really articulate kind of our theory of change around this and really be explicit about what we're expecting movements to do in the face of these massive global crises. At least in my view, the question in part is rooted with the scope that we are using to recognize impact overall. And one of the additional pieces that I think is important here is this need to recognize the value of investing in processes that have multiple parts and multiple actors in different points in time. Each of those stages of a process perhaps might have their own mini objectives. So just for example, a few minutes ago, the example of the recent adoption of the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which was promoted primarily by Via Campesina social movement, was offered as an example there, right? So I mean, on one side, you could say that the moment of impact is the moment when the UN General Assembly votes to adopt the resolution, and people get really excited about that moment. But I think in large part of why Via Campesina and their allies and all of their member organizations were effective in achieving that goal, and a greater recognition of the critical importance of land rights and rights to control natural resource rights for small farmers and people that work in rural areas, is because they were starting way back, organizing and mobilizing on the ground in communities of peasants and farm workers and indigenous peoples to really start framing the injustices that we're confronting in this context. I think this framing of food sovereignty started really gaining traction, right? And to really be unpacking not only the different values and meanings that land has for different smallholder groups, including groups that rely on access to the commons, right? But also really looking at, what are the different expressions of the problem. So, all of a sudden when you're talking to Via Campesina some years back, they're talking about who controls the seeds, and they're talking about women's rights and violence. And there's all these other issues that maybe on the surface don't seem related until you really look at it from the perspective of the communities that are really at the heart of those struggles. So, there's this building of a framework. Via Campesina really reached out in ways that were, demonstratively inclusive to bring more and more smallholder groups that were really stakeholders on these issues into the fold. So by the end, they're talking not just as farmers and that identity, but of small fishers and, again, indigenous peoples and broader swaths of the population that are really at stake there, And then, of course, I think everyone here is aware that where the rubber hits the road with this declaration isn't actually at the level of the UN moment, but it's having that movement still sustained over time, so they're prepared to actually ground those standards that have been recognized in the context of state obligations and actually indicating responsibilities of private actors as well, right? And then bringing that clarity back down to the ground, back down to the local level, so they could be sustaining processes over time to push for accountability for those gains. And so I think this whole perspective on process, multiple actors, and really letting the folks whose lives are directly affected frame what are the issues that are even relevant in that process seems to me to be an important piece of this conversation.
Thanks for lifting that up, Thea, particularly around the last point of if we're talking about assumptions, clearly funders are making particular judgments and assumptions around what scale is and what needs to be going, what kind of end goal we need to go after, where there's a lot of funders now flipping that and saying, how do we actually follow and be led by the folks that are most impacted and have them define in whatever framework or kind of indicators are relevant to them where we're trying to get to. I also want to just highlight a couple of things that have been coming up in the chat. First is this, a little while back, there was this conversation around kind of the trade-offs of when you look in pretty wholly at scale, you lose sometimes a focus on human rights and compromise some of those really important issues around justice. And so would love to put a bookmark in that. There's also this theme around scale being the ability to chip away at the power of current and dominant forces. And I think we could also tie that into the conversation around metrics. How do you actually know that that's happening? And how do funders kind of assess themselves in supporting that work? And then finally, there's this pattern of associating scale with pace and urgency and time. And that feels also like a really interesting piece of this, because that's what's so often done. Our minds make that leap. And yet often, or I've heard so far in this conversations, a couple funders saying that they're trying to untether that. Does any of the speakers want to speak to any of those points around kind of time and scale and how we unpack that? Or this kind of issue around trade-offs of going after scale and maybe losing some of the other kind of outcomes that are so important in the world in terms of human rights, but also in terms of what some of our grantee partners and those who are supporting value most.
And before we get a bit too far into the metrics conversation, I just think I do want to ground us on what is the movement infrastructure, like the grassroots groups that formulate and constitute many social movements are often working at the local level for things that are at the foundation of climate justice. So breathable air, drinkable water, dignified life, access to fair wages, making the intersections of labor justice, of climate, of access and control over food production, of water. And so I think it's important for us to not lose sight of the powerful work that many of these interconnected groups are trying to do. What social movements attempt to make possible is to take on the impossible, is to try and get folks most impacted by injustices into the rooms where there's power to be negotiated, and for us to actually build some shared political commitment. So there is room in social movement building for so many different actors to have a role. And I think sometimes we lose sight of, when we start beginning to have the conversation about how we measure impact, we forget that at the very deepest level, at the grassroots level, the impact is an actual transformational change in people's lives and their natural resources. I just don't want to lose sight of that, because we can get into a very heady conversation that removes us from these struggles and these fights being about very real things.
Nice. Thank you for that. That's a really helpful reframe. Kevin, I'm curious if you, how you might, or how you've grappled with bringing that frame into your work. So this point around metrics can only get you so far, but ultimately what we're after is transformation of systems, and also the transformation itself is actual, lives and livelihoods on the ground, which is not something that you can measure with just a few proxies and
Well, first of all, justice as a value is key to most solutions at work. Systems change may be part of a given solution at scale, or it might not. It may be some technology just gets taken to scale that has an effect on greenhouse gases, or it may be that your methodology involves the creation of a movement, or it may be that you change the way a government goes about some critical element. I think the key for me is the way we think about income is about really a change in outcomes. And if you're a climate change organization, your mission is to lower greenhouse gases. The world is burning. If what you do you can't connect the dots all the way to that, then you're not serious about impact. So I think we funders have skated on a lack of accountability about our impact for a long time, and I include myself in that. And whatever we fund, if it's climate, we want to know, okay, your model, if you deliver your model, it changes the behavior. It may include things like UN declarations, but then you have to connect the dots all the way to somebody doing something differently with mapping the behavior all the way to, if we do this, greenhouse gases are lowered. And if it doesn't do that, if you can't connect the dots, I don't think you have any business being in the climate change sector.
Thanks for that, Kevin. So I'm hearing a really clear, from Milagro, a really clear connection between, if there's not a shift in actual climate mitigation, that's not climate work. Any reactions or differences from some of the other speakers and how they think about climate philanthropy?
It's Ellen. I would just jump in and say that, Kevin, I think our approach to the climate work is ultimately about reducing the emissions. And we believe we need to reduce the power of the fossil fuel industry to break its grip over the political process so that, in fact, real policies can be advanced. But we also believe that building power and moving money into the solutions and solutions with a just lens is equally a part of that climate, our approach to climate. And ultimately, we must reduce the emissions without a doubt. So that's one of the end games. Another end game is that the new energy economy is a more just one, and that it's built with rights from the bottom up, and that we hold, we're very aware that we have already seen the development of a new industry, the renewable energy industry, that's being built without standards and principles, that's already having environmental and human rights impacts. So we're funding a whole bunch of work around the renewable sector, and to ensure this is the biggest industrial sector that's being built in decades, right? So it's going to have all sorts of impacts. So I think it's a big, complicated set of issues under this huge umbrella of climate, and we have to reduce the emissions, and we have to build just alternatives, and we have to build the power to stand up to those that are profiting from the current system. And that all has to be part of our theory of change in this work. And I think that all requires a movement lens.
Thanks, Ellen. To build on that and bring in some of what's being said in the chat, there's a couple comments around how climate mitigation is often includes more activities than we traditionally think in terms of technology or otherwise, in terms of agroecology and other ways of challenging some of the industries that are polluting the most. And then beyond that, I think there was a comment from Carol around it's many of the climate mitigation activities that are driven by communities that are most impacted also have all of these other outcomes that then also intersect and weave back to, as Ellen was just saying, addressing some of the root causes. So actually, you know, if we actually shift equity and power on the ground, then that will then lead back to really shifting the industries and the kind of monopolies that are driving climate change in the first place, which comes back to Thea's comment at the beginning around scale is really tied to and anchored in systems change as one of the ways that might be more like harder to make the assessment around, but ultimately leads to much more deeper transformation. Does any, I'm conscious of time, and we're actually going to shift in a moment to breakout groups, so folks can metabolize some of what they've been hearing. This was one of we got a lot of feedback that this was people really appreciated this on the last call. So I'm going to have each of the speakers go around one more time and share any final reflections, as well as an invitation to share one of the questions on your mind as you have been part of this conversation that you want folks to leave with as they grapple with what this frame means for their work moving forward. So how about we start with Thea?
Sure. I'd say my reflection is almost the question also. And it's sparked by the last round of discussion here. And it's really a question about where we think the problem lies. You know, like, for example, the climate crisis. Depending on what you understand to be the drivers that have led to this crisis is going to very much inform, of course, what kind of strategies we're investing in for solutions, right? And at least from the members in our network that are really on the front lines of this issue, you know, the stuff that I'm hearing from these groups, and these are groups, many of which are representing communities who are directly impacted in their very daily lives by existing impacts of climate change already happening. And so listening to them, they're talking about this extractive model of development and this way in which over time as society has progressed, the relationship that we have had with nature has been one that's conceptualizing nature as natural resources to be extracted and used for profit, for certain forms of development there, as opposed to a relationship with nature where we're a part of that nature, right? And I hear a lot of groups talking about the role that women play in these contexts as well, how much the global political economy, particularly as it has been scaling up from a production perspective and a consumption patterns perspective, has continued to build on marginalization of women and the remaining as invisible the women's contributions to the economy and to work over time. So there's links that they're making to questions around patriarchy, around, you know, valuing some people's contributions more than others there. And just a lot of our members are really calling out the overall model of development, or development in quotes, that's really been used and promoted that's kind of led us to this crisis. And so if that's the line of thinking, then, for example, you know, squarely market-based solutions to the climate crisis are really seen very skeptically, right? Because they're coming from the same logic that I think they're recognizing was driving the problem to begin with. And so for me, this question about how we can identify impact that social movements are generating in response to a really systemic analysis traces back to what we're recognizing are kind of legitimate parts of the why that we're in this mess to begin with. And so my question that I'd love to, you know, keep hearing from people about is, how are you understanding the drivers behind the problem, and what does that mean for what you're expecting to see with regards to impact?
Thanks, Thea. Let's turn to Kevin.
The world is burning, and we're not making much progress. And it's critical that theories of change, proposed solutions, map all the way to material outcomes in terms of rising temperatures and increased greenhouse gases and increased fossil fuel emissions. And I think as funders and as doers, we have the responsibility to understand how whatever we do maps to getting there. And we're all involved in theories of change, and we need theories of change. We need proposed solutions. We also need accountability that those theories of change will turn into measurable, documented change over time. So we know without measurement, you can't know if your theory is actually correct. And you can't know if your solution actually works. And you can't actually get better at what you do. So that's why we just think it's so critical that any climate-involved organization, their core mission is to lower greenhouse gases, and what their solution is, be it a movement, be it taking on capitalism, be it actually developing a technology, even a business model, it has to map to that.
Thanks, Kevin. Alan?
I've spoken a lot already, and there's some great stuff happening in the chat about measurement of impact. And I agree with Kevin that ultimately we all have to be measuring our macro impact on climate. One measure has to be the reduction of emissions. I think it's not the only measure. Within the climate crisis, it's not the only measure, but I absolutely agree with you. And I would say that we look, we're very careful not to impose a particularly rigorous set of our own measurements on our individual grantees. And I think one thing we haven't really talked about is the difference between our internal systems of measurement of our strategies and our grant making, and then our what our expectations are of our grantees and how we measure their effectiveness and I think that or their movement's effectiveness, the movement that they're situated within. And I think that would be a really interesting, deeper discussion to have. The last, because we look at everything from capacity to distributed leadership to, whether the strategy and tactics build efficacy, build power. It's all part of our internal discussions, but how we, and our analysis, but how we, what our expectations of our grantees in reporting is different. The last thing that I would just say is, and I'm a broken record on this for those of you that know me, is that we are inherently powerful in many, many ways in philanthropy. And philanthropy spends a lot of time talking about our power vis-a-vis our grantees. But we don't talk as much about our power within the systems that drive the problems that we're asking our grantees to solve. So I almost don't care about philanthropy. I'm not fighting philanthropy to divest its assets from fossil fuels anymore, because I think we've had that debate. And I don't think there's a single foundation that should not be asking that question or have already had that internal debate within their organization. But if you haven't, and if you hadn't made the decision to divest, you're on the wrong side. So I just feel that we have a responsibility to look at our power vis-a-vis the systems, not just our power, which we must look at vis-a-vis our grantees.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate you bringing that into the space. And also want to, I just want to point out, there's this interesting kind of difference in assumptions around accountability, whether it's accountability to the problem and accountability to what we're measuring in terms of impact, and accountability to the people on the ground that are actually doing the work. So also another kind of footnote for future conversation. Vinny.
Never a footnote. I think back to accountability to where the real climate solutions lie and have been tried and tested over decades. So the CLIMA funds grantee, the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, through employing a strategic mix of mass demonstration and strategic interventions, managed to get international financiers to divest from expanding polluting industries and a port in the city of Durban, affecting the lives of 500,000 people. That's a material outcome. Solidarity's members raised enough resources to make it possible for the Louisiana Rise to purchase 11 acres of land to block the southern end of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, material impacts on the lives of many indigenous peoples and their land sovereignty. So I think the question that I want to pose is, how can philanthropy rise to the challenge and the brilliance of the grassroots climate solutions that already exist?
Love it. Thank you. Okay, so thank you all to our speakers. We're going to move folks into a short breakout to share some reflections and verbalize some of what you've been hearing. So in a moment, you're gonna get a pop-up, and again, just press accept, and phone folks will be automatically pushed into different groups. You're gonna have about 8 minutes in these conversations, and I'm gonna throw up the questions on the screen, but Jesse, I think we'll also chat them. So sorry, let's put that up there. Okay, so the 3 questions are: what assumptions did you hear emerge in the conversation around scale? How do your views align or differ from what was talked about? And what is one way, if at all, your understanding of scale shifted during the course of the conversation? So again, you'll have about 8 minutes. We'll come back at 24 after, and we'll see you in a bit. Oops, I guess. All right, welcome back. As folks rejoin, if you can mute yourself again and share a highlight from your breakout in the chat box. I'd love to harvest a few of folks' reflections. Vinny said the process of scaling up itself can lead to commodification and extraction. Again, welcome back for those that are just joining. If you can mute yourself again and then use the chat box to share any highlights from the conversation that you just had. Give folks a couple seconds to start typing. And for those that are just joining, welcome back. Just sharing a couple of reflections and highlights from your conversation in the chat box. He also said, scales about how to share and translate solutions that work and then modify and adapt them to new localities and communities. Not one organization or solution that gets endlessly bigger or more widespread. Yes, really different understandings of how scale can be distributed. Becca said, need more funders who will support the long game of relationship and trust building necessary for movement building. Yeah. And Rob, we talked a little about scale's influence, not necessarily scale's funding. Yeah, nice. From Jesse, scales about how to share and translate solutions that work and then modify and adapt them to new localities and communities. Oh, I think I already said that. Great. And both Vinny and Ellen reinforcing that scales around building power. One more minute if folks want to drop their reflections in the chat box. As folks are continuing to chat, we're going to do one more poll. This is a mirror image of a poll that we didn't do at the beginning, but we're going to do it now. Sam is going to throw up a poll, the temperature check around what is folks' orientation around the framing of scale and did it change? So again, none of these answers might fit your response perfectly, but just choose the one that makes the most sense and the one that fits best. As folks are doing the poll, from Hillary, the idea that if you're doing climate work and you're not curbing emissions, ignores the work of adaptation on the side, the adaptation side of climate change, and the world has already changed because of climate change. And so recognizing the importance of resilience and adaptation is important. Thanks, Hillary. And from Rob, a huge question is whether we see movements as just a tool for reaching our solutions or as a solution and driver in and of themselves. Nice, thanks for that. Rajiv said, we spoke about scales as scaling climate mitigation solutions and building local power of communities and indigenous peoples, but we use different language terminology to describe our work. Interesting. Veronica said, we also spoke of who is allowed to fail and who is not. Yeah, a whole different conversation. Cool, so it looks like from our poll that most people, 40%, value the frame of scale more than at the beginning of the conversation. And then a couple folks valuing it less or not having it not being very relevant to the work. Well, thanks, Sam. Okay, so to close things out, thank you all so much for your participation and particularly for the really generative and rich conversation that happened in the chat box on the side. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing your thoughts and reflections with us. CLIMA Fund is really excited to host 3 more of these dialogues. The next one is going to be around the first week of February, and then again each month after that. And the next dialogue is about metrics and climate, which is something that was touched on a fair amount today that we're going to dig a lot deeper into. So it's shaping up to be a really good conversation, and you'll hear about that if you signed up for this one. Because of that, Jesse is going to share an evaluation form. It's literally 3 quick questions, really short, and your input will allow us to improve every time that we do another one of these dialogues. So please take one moment to do that. Thank you in advance. And before we close out, Sam is going to unmute everyone, and we're just going to do, except I need to mute myself over here. We're all going to do a round of applause for our speakers so we can all hear it. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.